Warm welcome to this COP27 virtual side event on implementing net zero aviation by 2050. My name is Tim Johnson. I'm going to be your moderator this evening, or morning or afternoon, depending on where you're watching this from. So I represent a UK-based NGO, Aviation Environment, and together with other environmental NGOs that make up the International Coalition for Sustainable Aviation, we've been participating in the environmental discussions at the UN's International Civil Aviation Organization. Last month, ICSA participated in ICAO's assembly, where 193 member states gathered to discuss, amongst a packed agenda, a long-term aspirational goal on climate change. So being close to that process, I think I can testify to the effort that was required to get not only the discussion, but that agreement, effort by the Secretariat, by states, by stakeholders, and we very much welcome the outcome last month. So with both states and industry now agreed on a global net zero goal for CO2 emissions by 2050, this event is being held to bring together leading representatives and experts from ICAO, government, industry, civil society and academia to tell you more about the assembly outcome, discuss what the goal means, how it can be implemented, and perhaps critically, what should happen next. Before I actually ask our panelists to introduce themselves, I just wanted to thank Dan Rutherford and Shreya Mithal from the International Council for Clean Transportation, who are members of ICSA, our ICSA coalition, and who are today's hosts. So they organised this event in the EU Pavilion. In terms of format, we'll hear very shortly from our 5 speakers, and then we'll have time for a Q&A session once we've heard all the presentations. So you'll need to use Slido to pose your question. Please don't wait until you've heard all of the 5 speakers. As you think of questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll have someone moderating that, and we can have the questions ready to go once the presentations are finished. So I'm going to ask our speakers in a minute to introduce themselves, but just a little part of context, I think, for today's session. As NGOs, both AAF and ICCT have been following the aviation debate for many years. And I say we participate actively in ICAO's work programme, whether it's standard setting or whether it's market-based measures or work to do with sort of alternative fuels. And more recently, the work to facilitate the discussions around the long-term aspirational goal. And we think it's something that is hugely important to guide states in their ambition, but also to sort of set the scenes and benchmark the progress that we make from here. So we see today's event as very much an opportunity to hear from all of those sort of stakeholders and states and from ICAO itself, and to consider, not only the ramifications of the agreement, but, crucially, what needs to happen next. So for the speakers, you have their bios on the EU Pavilion website, but can I ask the speakers now to say their name, their organisation, their primary area of focus, and as a scene setter, in one word, that's the challenge, but maybe I'll allow you a very short sentence. What was your reaction to the ICAO outcome on 2050 net zero target for aviation? And I'll go in order of presentation. So I'll ask Jane first, then Holly, Haldane, Dan, and Milan. And please, Jane, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Tim. And so Jane Hoopier, I'm the director in charge of the environmental program in ICAO. And I'm also the secretary of the main committee, the technical committee on aviation environmental protection. It's a committee of the ICAO Council. If you want me to talk about my reaction to the outcomes of the assembly, I think I would say, yoo-hoo, because, it was a long-standing wish that we had to align international aviation with the objectives, temperature objectives of the Paris Agreement. I think that is the way to go. I think that this will allow us, as is allowed in the last goal we set, to put a program in place and then to pursue action and have some real concrete outcomes, like we had the CO2 standard, CORSIA, SAF, all of that. So yoo-hoo was my big reaction after a very long, winding road. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Jane. I think an expression rather than a word, but Holly, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Tim. My name is Holly Grieg. I am the UK government lead for aviation decarbonisation. I think that's what you wanted me to say. Plus, my one-word reaction, I think I'd have to say galvanised. I felt like, actually, yes, we've done it, but now, what next? I felt like it was very motivating, and we've really got to get on to delivery and think about, for me, I felt like it was the end of the beginning. Now we've really got to get on and deliver. So galvanised, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Holly. Haldane.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and greetings, everybody. I'm Haldane Dodd. I'm Executive Director of the Air Transport Action Group, which brings together all the different parts of the aviation industry and works specifically on issues of sustainability. And of course, climate change is top of that list for our industry. As Jane said, yoo-hoo, I was yay, but oh gee, we've got a lot of work to do now. So it was a historic moment, and one that we should not forget. But we also have a lot of history to make ahead of us as well.
And Dan, would you like to make your introduction, please?
Absolutely, and thanks for moderating today, Tim. I direct the shipping and aviation programs at the International Council on Clean Transportation. We're a research-based nonprofit that advises regulators worldwide on how to set better emission standards for all modes of transport. Tim mentioned previously, ICCT is a member of ICSA and has been engaged in the ICAO process for about almost 15 years now. My role within that has been to, among other things, publish civil society's net zero technology roadmap for aviation, which I am, as a next step, starting to break down into metrics and benchmarks to measure progress. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this side event. In terms of my reaction, I would say I was relieved and then quickly chastened, I would say, once I realized the challenge that's ahead of us. But definitely a good agreement, and very happy to see it.
Thank you, Dan. And Milan, please.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining in for the session. I'm Milan Klöver. I'm a researcher at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I've worked recently on a lot of different aspects around climate modeling, and especially the effects how aviation actually warms the planet. And so my reaction today is yes, but very much in alignment, I think, what many others already said, but the but in my case really refers to the non-CO2 effects. So these are the effects that airplanes have on warming the planet beyond just carbon.
Thank you very much, Milan. So let's get started. We've established that ICAO recently held its assembly, and you've had some initial reactions that have set the scene. But Jane, can you tell us what happened at the assembly, how it happened, and more importantly, sort of what comes next? I sort of hinted that there's a lot of work that goes behind an assembly, and a lot of work by states to get everyone sort of aligned. But we'd love to hear and have your insight into how the assembly outcome came about.
Yes, thank you, Tim. I think how we got there. A lot of people, I think, were very skeptic that we would not get there. One of the reasons being that we did have a resolve to do that a while ago already for the, we would have to work on this long-term aspirational goal. But the main issue is that ICAO is a very technique-oriented decision maker. We are very geared to technology, to numbers, to results. And for us, as we did for the first goal, the carbon neutral in 2010, we needed to have what they call the feasibility study, right? So I think that was key in the question, how did you get there? We decided to do this journey in 2019. We very quickly involved the Council of ICAO that put forward together with us with a plan that involved the technical work, the consultation, the political consultation with states, and a feedback from a very open and transparent stock taking to make sure that everybody could bring the ideas, the information, the data to us so that we could analyze and tell back the Assembly, is that feasible? Yeah? And I think when the Assembly saw that very robust piece of work, and we have involved more than 400 of the best experts in the world. One is with us today as our moderator. We having the civil society, having the manufacturers, the airlines, the industry, everybody with was super important. So we provided to the Assembly and to a high-level meeting before the Assembly those results. We consulted with all states beforehand twice. We have 193 states that are ICAO member states, and all of that paved the way. I think the most important was the high-level meeting before the Assembly, where we showcase everything again to all of the states, and where we, after the consultation with states, already brought some ideas of how to move forward. And I think it was a very frank conversation among states that make it happen, because we sat down and we listened to each other and we said, how can we then make clear, because states to make sure that they would engage, they needed the assurance that their points would be honored, I would say. And only by reflecting very clearly in the text their points, we were able to reach that trust, get to that point where states said, okay, I felt listened. I feel that we have a technical study here that says we can do it. We have an understanding on how this roadmap to get to the implementation will have to happen. We all understand that not all states are starting in the same starting stage or line, but we all want to get to the same place. That means that we will need to capacitate those states. We will need to work together with industry and financial institutions to have the financial means to get there. We also fully understood that cleaner energy was going to be the big issue. And before the Assembly already, we created a program to show to states that that was possible to be done, instead of just a few states, full hand of states that could produce fuels for aviation to date. Now we have 193 potential producers of sustainable fuels to aviation. And so we have to capacitate those states. We want all of them to get involved. We want all of them to do their part. And they are all ready to do that. That was very clear. I think on the results now, that's how we got there. I think it was clear that nobody wanted to touch the decision of the high-level meeting in the Assembly, because it was a good decision, that everybody was comfortable with it. I also think that the decision came together with the decision on CORSIA to make sure that that was also robust. It's our global offsetting scheme that we had to adjust with COVID. People have to realize that when we decided to have the long-term goal, it was 2019. As we started the work, we had COVID. So we had to really replan everything, do everything virtual. That was one of the hard hits. And in the Assembly, it was clear that now we have to concentrate on the means of implementation. We have this program I just mentioned that mirrors somehow a program that we have for CORSIA, for capacity building, called ACT CORSIA, Assistance, Capacity and Training for CORSIA. Now we have something called ACT SAF, with its Assistance, Capacity and Training for Sustainable Aviation Fuels, where we will put the production, the producers, the states, the financial organizations, the industry, other implementation organizations to work with us, and to make sure that we match the needs with the capacitation, with the finance, etc. It's like, imagine a matching program for sustainable aviation fuels. cleaner fuels, all we will need. And in the ACTSAF, I invite all of the attendees to take a look at the website. In the future, what you'll see, all those initiatives will be reflected there transparently. The financing, the projects, how many refineries are being now, how many plants for SAF are being created in which countries. We really want that to be the platform, of platforms that showcase how we are implementing this objective that we just agreed in the Assembly in aviation. So that monitoring will be very important. Everybody that followed up how we do the monitoring on the CORSIA will understand is something extremely robust for our offsetting scheme. All airlines that fly internationally, they report. That is verified by a third-party verification, et cetera, et cetera. For the SAF, it will be transparent. Anybody from the public can check the information. In addition to all the CORSIA information already for SAF to be used as an option for the offsetting, you can use sustainable aviation fuels in CORSIA. That will be already there and clear, but if you're not in CORSIA, everything will be showcased. So I think the main work that we'll have to have next year is with the financial institutions and SAF. And we will have a big conference at the year end it's called CAF3, it's the third conference that we have for alternative fuels, we call. And in that conference, we need to put in place the right policies that will help us facilitate development and deployment for SAF. So we are focusing right now in clean energy. Of course, the manufacturers are focusing in continue to develop the technologies for electric aircraft. None of that is stopping. We will have all of that going on. We just have to prioritize next year the cleaner energy because our states want to take action. And if we want something by 2030, you have to start implementing. So we have to do feasibility studies for states that have not yet started with sustainable aviation fuels to see what is the best match for those states. We have to do the business case for states that already have more certitude of what's the feedstocks and processes that they prefer in their states, that feeds in their states. And for those that are more advanced, they have to scale up their production. So we have states in different stages, but we have to bring everybody on board. And that is why we need the right policies. At the end, I have to have apples and apples to add up and tell everybody how we are doing in terms of achieving our goal. So I think that's the priority next year. Our states will review their action plans, just to do a parallel with the process also in the UNFCCC. In the UNFCCC, they have the NDCs, and each state does its plan. In ICAO, we have the state action plans. It's a sector that is the goal, but each state then says how they are doing to get there, right? And so each state will now revise their action plans with this new goal in mind to say, that's what I need to get there. So help me here. And that's the capacity building that we'll be doing. That's the plan. A lot of work, but I think that it's the most exciting times for aviation because we have never seen so much innovation coming in, so much synergies, so much good energy, not only clean energy, but so much good energy moving forward. And I think you have heard just in the beginning how much we are cooperating to each other. So in a nutshell, that's it, Tim.
Jane, thank you so much. And thank you also for ending on a really sort of positive note. And there's lots of points of detail and next steps that I'm sure we'll come back to when we get to the questions. So I'm going to turn to you, Holly. If people are familiar with the language of the goal, they'll be aware that it's a sectoral goal for international aviation without attribution to states. And so I wondered what you could tell us about, what states need to do now. How's the UK approaching this challenge? Not especially with regards to ICAO, but in terms of the sort of the wider policy piece as well that Jane mentioned. Holly.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think I've got some slides, so I'm just hoping that they're going to pop up on the screen. I can't see them yet, Tim, but if you can, when you can you give me the thumbs up?
They're there, yes.
They're there, right, fantastic. Okay, cool. I don't know why I can't see them, so I hope I stay on the right slide. If it goes a bit skew-if, then please tell me. So as I said at the start, my name's Holly Grieg. I'm the Deputy Director for Aviation Decarbonisation in the UK, and my team are responsible for the UK government's approach to aviation decarbonisation. There's, of course, so much we could cover on this subject, and I suspect we'll get into all of that as part of the Q&A, but I've got a few moments now to cover a couple of key areas for the UK. So next slide, please. I think, anyway, so this should be the slide that talks about kind of what the UK is doing has done to support the Assembly. Great. So it goes without saying that the UK strongly supports and welcomes the Net Zero 2050 agreement at ICAO, and we very much hope we showed that support both throughout the Assembly, but just as importantly in the many years that were leading up to it. Our International Aviation Climate Ambition Coalition, or IACAC as we call it, was launched at COP26 last year, and it's great to now be at COP27 talking about the success of that coalition. So for those who don't know, the coalition brings together states who want to see high ambition from aviation on decarbonisation, and its uniquely diverse group of members were pivotal to the Net Zero 2050 agreement at ICAO. The UK also played a leading role in the development of the LTAG technical report, which Jane mentioned, which provided the comprehensive and much needed expert evidence showing a long-term goal was feasible. Next slide, please. So international leadership is hugely important, but you can only be credible in that as a country if you're delivering at home. So this year, the UK published the Jet Zero strategy, which sets out how we will ensure UK aviation gets to net zero by 2050. The document is published, so you can all read it at your leisure if you've not done so already, but I'd specifically draw out a couple of key elements for this discussion. The first is what we think is a first of a kind trajectory to 2050, which sets out the reduction in sector emissions we need to see in the aviation sector at incremental points between now and 2050 to know that we are on track to deliver our 2050 goal. So this allows us to transparently hold ourselves and the UK sector to account in their decarbonisation efforts. I'll also mention our 2040 targets in the strategy, which is net zero for UK domestic aviation and absolute zero for English airports. These targets recognise that some parts of the sector can and must go faster than 2050. Next slide, please. Then very briefly, as I said earlier, it's now all about delivery. So how we drive forward the uptake of measures we know are necessary to decarbonise aviation. That's truly sustainable aviation fuel, which brings with it so many co-benefits through mandating its use and supporting the financing of new SAF projects and facilities, as Jane was talking about, and then to capacity building on both CORSIA and SAF, ensuring that countries like the UK support others in their decarbonisation work. And finally, monitoring our progress. How can we know and indeed make sure that we succeed and that we're on the right path? So these are just a few initial points from me. I'm looking forward to discussing wider areas in more detail as part of the panel discussion. I hope that all flowed in terms of narrative and slides. And back to you, Tim. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Holly. And there's certainly sort of themes emerging between some of the things that Jane said around sort of the need to monitor and your sort of slides around monitoring. And again, that sort of positivity sort of coming through in terms of next steps. So I said at the beginning that ICSA welcomes the goal, so did many states. One thing that very much came across in the sort of closing statements on this agenda item at the Assembly was also the recognition that the hard work starts now. Haldane, I think your yay was counterbalanced by yes, that's what we need to think about. And so I think the next question is to both you, Haldane, and to you, Dan. Can you tell us how industry and NGOs see that sort of decarbonisation pathway, and more importantly, sort of critically, what's that sort of near-term bit look like? So Haldane, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important also just to note the multi-stakeholder approach that the UN in general takes, but ICAO certainly builds at the heart of anything that it does, and certainly the work leading up to the announcement and the agreement this year did take into account everybody from states to civil society to industry as well. I think it's also important just to note that in industry, we a year earlier agreed to go net zero 2050 as our goal as industry. And I just want to sort of pause there for a second on some of the motivations that we have to do that. And I think one of the reasons that we decided as a collective industry to push towards net zero, aside from the science and all the work that needs to be done in order to meet the Paris Agreement aims and our climate commitments, was really just the fact that a coordinated approach for us at a global level really works best. We're an industry that likes working across borders on standards that exist everywhere. And of course, we have a UN agency that helps us achieve that. But of course, there's a lot of pressure that comes on the industry as well, whether that be from shareholders, whether it be from financial institutions, from the public, from our corporate customers. But increasingly, we're also hearing from employees that they want to work for an industry that not only connects the world, but does it in a sustainable way as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why we really put such a push behind getting an LTAG agreement through at ICAO, because we knew that if we were going to achieve the goal that we had set a year earlier, it was going to require efforts not just from us, but by governments as well. And setting that policy at a global level, it helps create the framework for us to ask for financing for SAF production, for us to really explore some of these technology options as well. When we look at the sort of pathways and what we need to do now, yes, there's certainly a role to play in a range of different parts of what we call the basket of measures, or our different pillars of action, if you like. So on the technology side, there's a lot of work going on into areas exploring options like hydrogen as a potential use of hydrogen for combustion within aircraft, direct combustion, or as a feedstock for power to liquid sustainable aviation fuels as well. There's a lot of discussion around electric, but I think if you look at the different pathways that get us out to our net zero 2050 goal, really the most significant opportunity that exists there is with sustainable aviation fuels. And we know that is an opportunity that exists today. We're already flying on it, very small quantities of it. But at the end of the day, we've got a lot of the technology down for sustainable aviation fuel. It really just becomes an economic issue. And as Jane said, and Holly said as well, that's a financing question. So that certainly is something that we need to really push on as well. We think that by 2050, SAF will meet around 50 to 75% of our net zero mitigation pathways with technology, operations, and some limited amount of market-based measures or out-of-sector measures to deal with residual emissions. So SAF really is actually quite a big chunk of our pathway, whichever pathway we look at. I think just one important note as well before I hand over to Dan is it's really important, and particularly you come to an event like COP and you realize how important an inclusive approach is, that this can't just be a Europe or North America or developed world story. It has to be something that we can take across the world and make possible in countries everywhere. And we've done some work looking at what the opportunities are that exist with sustainable aviation fuels in particular. Building new energy economies in countries, almost every country around the world could provide some level of SAF development. And of course, that helps maintain some existing fossil fuel infrastructure and shift that over to new energy and green energy infrastructure, and also hopefully help sustain and create more jobs as well. We think about 14 million jobs worldwide could be either sustained or created through shifting the entire industry onto SAF as well. And to achieve that, we need capacity building that Jane's talked about. We also need the state action plans, but also the governments in countries everywhere to put in place national pathways, working with industry, working with the energy industry as well to make that happen. So yeah, I'm very positive, very excited, daunted a little bit by the task ahead of us, but actually it's a really great opportunity to work together on solving this issue in a very comprehensive way.
Thanks very much, Haldane. Dan, I'm going to put the same question to you. How do you see the decarbonisation pathways, the implementation issues?
Certainly, and I am going to pick up on Haldane's point about the need for national pathways. Jane actually made this point earlier about the importance of state action plans going forward to implement the long-term aspirational goal. So I'll present some preliminary research on this topic. Next slide, please. So we've talked a fair amount already about the agreement itself. Just to remind everyone, it is a 2050 net zero CO2 goal without attribution to individual states and also without any interim targets, for example, for 2030 or 2040. So this does represent certain challenges to developing metrics and benchmarking for national policy. But here at the ICCT, we started to pick out that question. Our starting point is really the various technology roadmaps that went into the agreement. There were a number of these detailed plans of how the aviation sector could achieve net zero emissions, released by governments, by industry, and then by ourselves. And this chart is just showing the most aggressive pathway under these 7 roadmaps that we've analyzed. In this case, we've normalized the emissions to 2019 levels, since different roadmaps had different scopes in them. But what you can see is, on average, the technology roadmaps that underpin the net zero agreement suggest that CO2 will need to peak around 2025 from aviation in order to put us on a pathway towards net zero in 2050. And you can see the business as usual trend for emissions growth up to COVID was about 3% per year. So we've got a really significant challenge ahead of us. Next slide. So my research team is working to break down this global goal into national pathways so that we can help advise governments. And also, as the state action plans start to roll into ICAO, we can assess how far they get us towards meeting the 2050 net zero target. I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we're going about that, and then present some very high level results. Next slide. So fundamentally, we need to take into account at least 3 things, 3 different factors, as we're starting to take the global goal and break it down for individual countries. The first is that traffic growth rates are expected to be different across the world going forward. According to the Boeing commercial forecast, passenger traffic is expected to increase about 3.8% per year through 2050. But there is variation across the globe, ranging from as low as 2.5% in North America up to 7% in South Asia. And this figure reflects the fact that certain countries have mature aviation markets, while others are still growing there as part of their economic development trajectory. And we need to make sure that national benchmarks takes this diversity into account. Next slide. We also know from our research that not all flights are equal, and not all fleets are the same in terms of carbon intensity. So we do see some variation from country to country on the carbon intensity of their operations. In 2019, on average, passenger flight in the world emitted about 110 grams of CO2 per passenger kilometer. That's on a well-to-wake basis. But we do see diversity across country. Here I'm showing the top 25 markets in terms of traffic in 2019. And we see, due to factors like fleet age, seating configuration, load factor, and also stage length, that flights departing some countries can have carbon intensities as low as about 98 grams per passenger kilometer, and others as high as 124. We need to take this into account in our modeling because we don't want to penalize any states for taking early action. Next slide. And the third factor we're taking into account in our modeling is just that access to aviation and mobility, and therefore emissions, varies widely across nations. So we've taken the step of categorizing the top 25 markets in terms of their maturity. So emerging markets, baseline markets, and then mature markets. And you can see there's a very wide variation in carbon dioxide emissions per capita, ranging from as low as 16 kilograms per person per year in India to a global average of about 100. And then for the wealthiest sort of hub states, up to 2,000 or even close to 3,000 kilograms per person. So this is one of those factors we want to take into account as we create fair country pathways. Next slide. So what we've done preliminarily is we've categorized the countries. We've then taken these three factors into account, and we started to draw up the pathways that get us from 2019 down to net zero in 2050. I'm not going to present the results of individual countries because the work is preliminary, but you can see kind of the general bands of how normalized emissions are expected to evolve over time towards a net zero target. And really the big takeaway here is we have a huge challenge ahead of us. In order to build space for these emerging markets to continue to grow their traffic, and as a result, grow emissions before sustainable aviation fuels and other technologies fully mature, we'll need really aggressive action from the mature markets. So according to our modeling, on average, emerging economies will be able to grow their aviation emissions out through 2030 before turning them downward towards net zero. But it does suggest that the most mature markets need to already have peaked their aviation carbon dioxide emissions. Now, we can't go back to 2019 and redo that year, but luckily, or unluckily, if you're an airline, we are still working through the COVID-19 downturn. So this research suggests that for those really mature markets, the emissions from aviation should remain below 2019 levels through 2050. Next slide. And that's really all for me. Again, ICSA welcomes the agreement at Assembly. Our job as advisors to government is to generate these metrics and benchmarks, both to advise those governments and then track progress going forward. And that is all for me. I'll turn it back to you, Tim.
Dan, thank you so much for the presentation and for sharing, some of our thoughts around, what happens between now and 2050, especially in terms of sort of interim milestones. So I'm going to turn to Milan, who's also going to give out our final presentation. Milan, we've spoken a lot about carbon dioxide so far, but we know aviation's total climate impact's 3 times that of its CO2 emissions alone. So you hinted at this in your opening remarks, a good deal at ICAO, but what about non-CO2? So what can we do to raise the visibility in non-CO2, both in terms of informing the public, and are we ready to start developing policy and measures to go with it? Over to you, Milan.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's probably 2 points that I really want to make today in order to address this visibility. And I feel that there is often not a really clear understanding of how these non-CO2 effects work. And so my slides hopefully can illustrate that a bit further. But really the first message is that, yes, the non-CO2 effects are massive. You said that they're roughly 2 to 3 times higher than the CO2 effects alone. So just addressing CO2 wouldn't actually solve the problem. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of leverage coming from this because there are suddenly, and there's different CO2 time dependent. So this graph I took from David Lee's paper from last year, which really illustrates all the very complex radiative and chemical reactions that happen in the atmosphere once an airplane emits or burns jet fuel. So on one side, you have the CO2 that you can very easily think of just like once it's up there in the atmosphere, it stays there. But then on the other hand, you have these non-CO2 effects. So this is basically just an umbrella term to group together nitrogen oxides that react with ozone and methane and water vapor in the atmosphere, but also other things like contrails. This is at least something that we can see, but also emissions of like soot, like carbon and so on. And so these non-CO2 effects, really importantly, they have a time scale associated with them, right? So cirrus clouds that develop from contrails they're definitely gone in a day. Sometimes they basically evaporate immediately. But some of these methane timescales there, sometimes they reach up to like 10 years or so. And conceptually, next slide, please. I find this best illustrated if you think about this like a hypothetical scenario where if we were to stop flying today, what would actually happen is that the CO2 levels from caused by aviation would stay constant, right? Because we do not dump any more CO2 in the atmosphere, but also none of that actually really goes out. So, however, the non-CO2 effects, while they increase the warming effect of aviation in an upward trend, would also, once we stop flying, would actually decrease again due to these timescale effects. And so if you add the two together, if you were to stop flying today, you would actually revert some of the warming. And this is really nicely explained on the next slide. You can basically, therefore, if you add up the two terms, and this is what scientifically you would have to do, so just looking at CO2 alone isn't enough, you could basically think about a scenario where if we implement some kind of production policy, and this could be because people decide to fly less, or efficiency is increased, or we use different alternative fuels that are actually like sustainable and have a lower carbon footprint associated with them, that you still fly, the CO2 will slightly still increase, but the non-CO2 will decrease, and adding the two together, you end up with conceptually this net zero warming idea where the actual warming cost from aviation is more or less constant. And next slide, please. So this is a paper that we published last year, putting some numbers into this idea. And you can see that the non-pandemic scenario would really put us up to 0.1 degrees of warming by 2050. And if we think about our 1.5 degree, this is really not much. There's not much left to reach the 1.5. And if aviation would consume 0.1 degree of that, that would be a very large share. If you include the effect of COVID, but still assume 3% increase of flights per year, as Dan already illustrated that this would be the case, then actually COVID didn't have much of a big effect. Very importantly, what's phrased here as zero growth scenario. So really the scenario that means you don't end up flying more, or like emitting more, you basically just emit every year the same, actually still causes warming because the CO2 keeps adding up. And so the sweet spot in that sense, if we really want to understand how like net zero warming aviation could work, is where every year the emissions decrease by 2%. And as we've talked a lot about sustainable aviation fuels, on the next slide, we have done this calculation not based on any real sustainable aviation fuel, but on a hypothetical zero carbon fuel, right? So really a fuel where you think, okay, well, let's say the CO2 effect, and in our models, we can just like eliminate this effect. The CO2 effect would not exist, but then the non-CO2 effects are obviously still in place because you still have this combustion engine running, and what comes out of the tailpipe will still cause some of these non-CO2 effects. And you can see that even if you were to reach 50% of zero carbon fuels by 2050, you would actually still cause additional warming. And only if you reach levels around 90% of zero carbon fuels, then you would actually hold any aviation-induced warming. And so what I really want to highlight is here that we do need a lot of research still to understand what it means to upscale the production of sustainable aviation fuels, but however they're actually in the end produced, to something like 2 billion liters, order of 2 billion liters per day in 2050. Because, and I mean, there's a couple of like preliminary calculations that people have done, but this is very likely associated with enormous costs, electricity use, land use, and or geological storage capacity. And this could put many other sectors absolutely under pressure. And so I really want to raise that the research really is needed in order to prove that sustainable aviation fuels could be a sustainable way forward, because at the moment, I'm really highly doubting that this is actually the case. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Milan, and for the questions. Maybe actually, I don't know whether the panel wants to react to Milan's last challenge. If you do, I think the best way is just to come in. If people want to say anything,
Hey,
you've unmiked. I think you want to respond.
I'd like to start, I think. So just to thank first all the speakers by raising so important things. I'll just go back to something that Milan was presenting, because for us, Nuncio 2 is also super important. And since we did, I don't know if the attendees also know that we were the first sector that requested the IPCC to do a specific study of the sector to see the effects in the upper atmosphere, to see if we needed to put some policies in place to address that too. The issue that is the most complicated for us is we are not scientists in ICAO. We have a group of scientists working with us in Cape. By the way, David Lee, it's exactly the rapporteur that leads that group there. So we receive the latest of the science in ICAO to be aware of. We have white papers presented always to us to see how that progresses. But of course, we take the advice from IPCC as the global scientific input that we take in consideration in ICAO. But maybe one thing that for us is always very complicated with the non-CO2 is the uncertainty, that we have with those results. So when you see all the range of still uncertainties that we have with the radiative forcing in many of those non-CO2 effects, makes it much harder for us to consider something in terms of the policy to address because of these uncertainties. That's always something very complicated for us. I just wanted to highlight that, because if it was something crystal clear and we had the agreement of all the scientists coming back to us and saying, this is it, the science now it's fixed. Every time we ask, this is it, and they say, no, it's still a lot of uncertainty here and there, and it's never a final word. So Milan, can you explain to us again? I know that, David has brought to us many times how this uncertainty has reduced now here, but then there's more uncertainty there, and there's new discoveries that they made, new breakthroughs in the research. Can you explain to us a little bit more about that uncertainty and how that works for this non-CO2? Because again, CO2, it's crystal clear to us. Everybody knows that how to deal with it, that we have to reduce this. All those messages are always very clear. With the non-CO2, it's not. I have had scientists explaining to us, very high ones, saying, what the uncertainties are very high. And in addition, this, when you say 2 times the CO2, not 2 times the CO2, that doesn't mean that you just multiply the CO2 by those numbers. So can you explain to us a little bit about that? I think it's and the SAF, because again, message that came from the scientific side when we were starting to explore SAF was, this is good news, because that will also help with the non-CO2 effects. That is the message we received. So can you, all those doubts that you just raised back to us on the sustainable aviation fuels. So sustainable aviation fuels help, right? Can you ascertain that?
If you could answer both those sort of challenges around SAF and the uncertainty points relatively briefly, and while you're doing that, I'd just like to tee up the others. 2 of the issues that I think have come out of this discussion so far for me, there was a lot of momentum that built up to the assembly. Have we got the energy to sustain that? And if so, how? But both within the industry and from a state point of view, how do we sustain that momentum? And the other one is practical thoughts on a lot of states mentioned financing, either in the terms of it, in terms of its existence, or in terms of the fact that they would need it and the capacity building to help with the transition. So thoughts that you may have around practical next steps on financing and momentum. But Milan, in the meantime, would you like to respond to Jane's points? But please try and keep it brief.
Absolutely. So on the uncertainty, yes, there's always some uncertainties, but what we're basically, where the science currently is that it is not the exact magnitude is not clear, but the sign is clear, meaning that for policy implications, this is quite straightforward because we know that the non-CO2 effects increase the warming effect of aviation by 2 to 3. And this is where I'm kind of saying usually 2 to 3, because you're absolutely right. This depends on, it's a global average. You can't technically say like, okay, there's an airplane now going, because for example, the contrail creation, and therefore the cirrus clouds that are created by this airplane depend, for example, also on the humidity. So you basically even have like the uncertainty of a weather forecast in there if you so want to. And so that obviously makes it hard in terms of like, let's say, putting a carbon price onto a single flight. But in terms of a global average, you usually, this uncertainty is really within this like 2 to 3 times CO2. And I think this is, I believe, very much so good enough for policy implications. You mentioned this in terms of sustainable aviation fuels. And yes, one of the big advantages that we also see in our models is that the sustainable aviation fuels, regardless of the CO2, also have an advantage because they have less aromatics in them. So meaning that basically they create effectively fewer condensation trails. And this is something that for jet fuel could also be explored. I don't know exactly where the research currently is there on the very technological side, but yes, sometimes the sustainable aviation fuels can also reduce the non-CO2 effects. You're right about that. But it still doesn't really help us with the point that the amount of sustainable aviation fuels we would need is so enormous that, we don't really know what impacts that would have on this production chain.
Thanks, Milan. Haldane, I don't know whether you're responding to that or you want to come in on the sort of financing and momentum question, but please. A
little bit of both, maybe. Just on the quantity and sort of quantum of SAF required. Actually, interestingly, Milan, you mentioned the 90% figure for 2050. That's actually exactly where we've modeled it to get to 90% of our fuel supply being SAF by 2050. We know that's a challenge for sure, but that's where we're pushing. That's what our work is going to be over the coming years, and that comes back to the finance thing in a second. On the non-CO2, I think it's really important that we further explore what's happening in terms of the science side of things, for sure, but that shouldn't stop us from looking for solutions. We know that we can avoid contrail formation today. It's relatively easy, but it can be done. What it requires is some technology, is surveillance of the types of atmospheric conditions that cause that, the decision-making point about whether we fly through those conditions or whether we fly under them or around them, which could create more CO2 emissions. But the technology is being looked at, certainly now that we've got satellite-based navigation being implemented in more and more places around the world. That could help. There probably needs to be some more monitoring from a meteorological perspective there as well. And there are some other solutions that are also being looked at from a software perspective, let's say. So there are things that are being looked at, and certainly we should continue that whilst we also try and improve the science that sits behind it. Tim, you mentioned before about the momentum and whether we have that momentum. I think we're going to need a lot of financing to get us there, for sure. Do we have the momentum still continuing within the industry? I'm fairly sure we do. In fact, I'm certain we do, because before COVID, we had about $7 billion worth of offtake agreements for sustainable aviation fuel from airlines around the world. During COVID, that has increased to $25 billion. During COVID, the worst time in our industry's history, we have also agreed to go net zero, despite the cost that we know will come our way if we do that. So the momentum is there. We just need to bring others on board, including the finance community. But I don't want to run out of time and hand it over to some others to speak.
Okay, and I have Holly and Dan waiting to come in. So Holly, you've gone sideways actually.
I don't know why. I'm very sorry. I'm on a different device than I'm used to because I'm in Egypt at COP27 and I can't make it work properly, but I hope you can hear me. Tim, I just wanted to come back on a couple of your points and about the momentum. Look, as far as I'm concerned, actually the agreement at ICAO, following that agreement, we've never been more certain about what we need to do to decarbonise the sector. We know what the goal is, and the technical report told us what we need to do to get there. So for me, it's never been clearer about what we need to do. Completely recognise the uncertainties that have been mentioned around non-CO2, but I won't delve back into that for now, given the time. But I think we've never been more certain, and frankly, the momentum has to be there. We have to decarbonise the aviation sector, otherwise we won't be able to have it. That's the reality of where we are now when it comes to aviation. So I very much hope the industry's got the momentum. We certainly have from a government point of view. From what I've seen so far, they understand the challenge. It's really, like I said, we've now got to hold ourselves all to account in terms of the delivery. Just to come back very briefly on your point about finance, Tim, what we hear constantly is that the finance is available, but what they need is the policy certainty. They need to have confidence that there is going to be the policy certainty when it comes to the sustainable aviation fuel framework, for example. So I think coming back to what Jane was saying earlier, the importance of SAF over the course of the next year and having policy certainty, but both at a global and a domestic level, I don't think you can overemphasise. From a UK point of view, we're consulting on a mandate, which will hopefully set clear the demand side of things and hopefully support with the supply. But we need those agreements at an international level as well. And then just very briefly as well, we need to think about how we incentivise SAF. So thinking about schemes such as Corsia, such as ETS, whether it's the Renewable Transport Fuels Obligation in the UK, how do we recognise the use of SAF in those schemes and incentivise it so that we're starting to really encourage uptake? There's loads we could unpack there, but I'm very conscious of time, Tim, so I will pause and try and sort out my video. Sorry.
That's okay. Dan, would you like to pick up on some of these issues? In particular, I think this idea you spoke about the need for interim targets, and we talked about policies and incentives. Can we do that without some sort of interim guiding hand? But please pick up on that and other issues.
Certainly. Actually, I wanted to double back on a point that Milan made. By the way, I love that paper, Milan. It's probably my favorite aviation scientific journal paper to date. So congratulations. Did want to double back and talk about the aromatics issue, because independent of carbon intensity, SAFs are expected to have these contrail abatement benefits, but there's nothing magical about them. It's really about the chemical composition and particularly the aromatic content. And as you mentioned, it's very possible to hydrotreat fossil jet fuel and reduce that aromatic content and provide those same contrail abatement benefits. So we're actually going to release a paper on this within the next couple of months, looking at the cost, which is expected to be quite small, actually, in comparison to the price increment of SAFs. In terms of, Tim, your question on momentum, I mean, if you put together my presentation and Milan's, it does really suggest that in the short term, our focus should be on the non-CO2 component. CO2 is, not only is it hard to get out of the atmosphere, the technologies to abate it are relatively, nascent at this point. So in terms of short-term priorities, I think we can build on the momentum and focus on the fuel quality issue or the routing issue that Haldane mentioned, and try and tackle that non-CO2 component first. In terms of the financing angle, sorry, Tim, I'm not directly answering your question, but I do think this is an important component. According to the LTAG analysis, we will need up to $4 trillion of cumulative investment through 2050 in order to hit a net zero target. And the question of how to generate that revenue without, and that support without subsidizing frequent flyer behavior, while also guaranteeing access to aviation services for poor communities, poor countries is a key one. We released a report a couple months back that investigated the use of a global frequent flying levy as a way to raise finance in order to pay for SAFs and other technologies. So I think that's something that government should be taking a close look at as a next step.
Thanks very much, Dan. And we did have a question, which is too late.
Can I?
Sorry, Jane. We've been asked to.
Yeah.
What if you can do it in 10 seconds?
Yes, I can. Please. I think that we have to be. We have a big momentum right now, Tim. We have just to be careful on when we are talking about the need for this policy framework, not to scare people away from this momentum. I think the agreement was so strong, and that was led to this momentum, is that the talks that we are having is that we are going to have a global framework, but that would be technologically agnostic, that, is not one fits all, that we would respect the boundaries of each of the states and the choices. So we have to be very, very, very cautious as we want to move as a state, as industry, individually, not to with this willingness to advance very fast. We scare the others and we undo a momentum that's very powerful. That's why the conference next year is very important, because we will hear from everybody what is this framework, that the policy framework that will really work. So I think we have heard here, even for the non-CO2, there is some issues that we can do right now. And I think we can get agreement on those issues that we can do right now without imposing something that might be received by the others not so easily. So respecting this technologically agnostic is very important. So I think we have the momentum. Let's build upon this momentum, but there has to be careful not to undo the big agreement that led to the momentum. That would be my 5 steps.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's an interesting tension, isn't it, between wanting to move forward, but also trying to sort of, learn at the same time and be cautious. So I'll say there's one question I don't have time to pose, but I will acknowledge it in closing, and that was just as someone asked, we ought to think not just about aviation and its energy needs, but the wider societal and economy needs for energy and where that's best deployed. So I'll leave that there as a statement. I'm going to say thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to ICCT for hosting, to the technical team at the Pavilion for making sure everything ran smoothly. I think the takeaways for me from this session, when you all spoke, I think the consensus around the goal and the willingness to move forward, I think that was noted. But I would stress that I don't think it was just words. I think everyone was actually cautious of what comes next and acknowledging what comes next. So it wasn't just, yes, we've done it, but yes, we've done it, and the hard work really needs to start now. So that I think is a good platform for ICAO and for states to move forward. And I'm sure as NGOs and Haldane on behalf of industry, we look forward to continue engaging with you on those particular issues. So I'm sorry we've overrun by a few minutes, but thank you all very much for your participation, for listening, for your questions, and I say thank you very much once again to our speakers. Thank you and good night.